So Elon, for all of his flaws, created this category of EVs. And I have engineer friends who say, well, the problem with the Tesla is, why do we need such a high torque? Why do we need such a high weight of vehicle? It's an over-spec'd vehicle for what's really needed. Yeah, well, that doesn't have to come from Tesla. That's going to come from fast followers. It's going to come from other companies. If you're a category creator, if you're a category definer, you should be happy that you're normalizing some change that needs to be made, and then just accept the reality that others will play their part too. Do you know the marshmallow test? Is the test where you give a 5-year-old a marshmallow, say if you can stop yourself from eating that marshmallow for 30 seconds, then I'm going to give you 2 marshmallows. And some kids can do it and some kids can't, and there's some reasonable evidence that the kids who can hold on for 30 seconds do better in life. It's a shocking state of affairs that if you look at a flow diagram of where the climate finance is going, it's all going to energy and mobility. Not enough is going to built environment, but a pathetic amount is going to agriculture and forestry. Food and ag is a fantastic area because the imperative to solve the problem is not only climate, right? The topsoil is being depleted at an alarming rate. If we don't fix things, then we're headed in the direction of mass famine. We'll run out of food. We also have some interesting ideas about geothermal. I'm really hot on geothermal. It doesn't have these intermittency problems of the other renewables, and it all happens underground. So some of the land use issues that we're currently grappling with on renewables, which of course bleeds into agriculture, get solved.
Welcome to today's episode, where we speak with Dr. Chris Coleridge. He's had an illustrious 3-decade-long career, where he's built and sold companies, taught strategy and entrepreneurship at the London School of Economics and the University of Cambridge, and founded leading venture builders focused on climate tech. We'll speak to him about where he sees big opportunities to build businesses in climate and what his experience has taught him about being a great entrepreneur. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Hi, Dr. Chris. Thanks for speaking with us today. To start with, I'd love to pick your brain on the top 3 areas where you think there are opportunities to build a climate-focused business today.
Well, I think number 1 on the list is creating the Tesla of housing. So what I mean by that is we've got, Tesla. One of Tesla's wonderful tricks was to get people to feel that making a transition to an electric vehicle was a positive, not a negative. And that it was a higher status thing, not a lower status thing. It was a lifestyle move for the privileged, not just a hair shirt for the ecologically conscious. And so I think there's a similar transition to be done in housing. Now, I have to say, I've been thinking that for about 4 years, and there are certainly plenty of people now working on that intuition, working on that hunch. But that's, so I'm late. I'm too late now. That was my insight. More speculatively, I think there's some interesting opportunities in grid flexibility, and that's a classic entrepreneurial problem where you've got to be patient, right? And you've got to be willing to say, okay, we're going to do something that will only work in region X, country X, network node Y, and perfect it, and then hope to do such a fantastic killer job in this tiny little beachhead segment that we expand to the world, right? And that's, of course, it's a high risk, but that I believe is where the ideas are going to come from. Finally, I'll mention food and agriculture. I mean, it's a shocking state of affairs that if you look at a flow diagram of where the climate finance is going, it's all going to energy and mobility. Even, not enough is going to built environment, but a pathetic amount is going to agriculture and forestry. And I believe if I was starting something in that area, it would be not a million miles away from what the Faster Climate Impact Project is doing. It would be an aggregator. It would be an integrator. It would be bringing together assets that are being created, because there's clearly a critical mass issue there. There's clearly an issue where too many people are trying to sell to low margin farmers. Farming is a low margin business, as you know, and so I believe there's plenty of technical innovation going on, which I was privileged to see and back some of at Carbon 13, but not enough business model thinking, not enough really clear business model thinking. So that's what I would have brought there. So yeah, that's my hit parade.
Wow, all of those sound like super interesting ideas to explore. You mentioned Carbon 13, which is a leading venture builder you helped found about 5 years ago. And I believe you've made some 65 investments through them. Did you have a big aha moment that set you on this path to build something that tackles climate change?
It's a very boring aha moment. I was reading "No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference" by Greta Thunberg, which is a very slim volume. And I took the logic and I realized that in the lecture theater, what I say is entrepreneurship is there to solve the big problems, the uncertain problems, the problems that other people don't want to solve, and therefore entrepreneurship is perfectly suited to addressing the climate crisis. What do I know about? I know about entrepreneurship. I know about strategy. So that's the contribution that I can make.
Yeah, and maybe the next question from there is why not found a climate business just directly and choose to do an accelerator instead?
Yeah, well, it's a question I often ask myself, and I do have some ideas for climate tech businesses, but ultimately, I'm not going to leave the day job as an academic. I think the privilege that I have here, the platform I have here, means that the most impact I can make is working on projects where I can retain my faculty position while also working on climate tech on the side. And so a real startup, as I would tell any aspiring entrepreneur, you need to be prepared to go all in. Whereas Carbon 13, I didn't go all in. That's why I stepped down as CEO. My new project, I'm one of 6 partners in the business. They're all prepared to go full time once we achieve the critical mass. But that's a sort of base condition, is that the platform I have as a Cambridge person is something I want to use.
Yep, that makes sense. Another thing you mentioned was the lack of funding in food and ag. That's something I did not know much about. Could you tell us more?
Yeah, if you look at if you it's a useful resource on this is to go to a fantastic outfit called the Climate Policy Initiative, and every year they do a Sankey diagram that shows the sources and uses of climate finance, and you'll see that AFOLU, as they call it, agriculture, forestry, and other land use, is getting roughly 10% of the funding of energy.
Okay, that's astonishingly low. I think I get why. It's because the CO2 energy narrative is now more mainstream. But I think the emissions or the impact of food and ag is probably not as out there.
Well, food and ag is a fantastic area because the imperative to solve the problem is not only climate, right? It's the topsoil is being depleted at an alarming rate, and we're headed, if we don't fix things, then we're headed in the direction of mass famine. Forget about all burning and dying in floods. We'll run out of food.
Yep. And that'll lead to mass migration and other kinds of issues.
Yeah, yeah.
Have you heard of this thing called the climate fresque?
I have, yeah, really interesting initiative. I like the bottom up nature of the project a lot.
Yeah, so I'm actually a climate fresque facilitator. And one of the things I find that people find quite interesting at the end of sessions is just this thought of how you start with the levers of climate change and you end up with disease and war as kind of the end results.
Yeah, yeah. Well, absolutely. I think these feedback loops are really very difficult for people to understand, and I've had some fascinating conversations over the last couple of months where if you talk to policymakers, for example, people just assume that the current order of things is going to continue, and they're imagining, okay, we've got maybe more floods on the way, more food stress, more this, more that. It's all going to happen within the current geopolitical framework. And I think, well, if you look at history, there's nothing to suggest that our current geopolitical order is in a kind of immutable state of affairs. There's every reason to think that these kinds of stresses are going to put a lot of stresses on our ability to run what we currently think of as a sort of global economy and so on. I'm mentioning that I realize we're talking. Your podcast is Climate Ventures, but I think it's a helpful guide if you want to think about your own personal impact. Is to think about, okay, what innovations could I work on that will be relevant in many different future scenarios of geopolitics. I personally found it much more satisfying at Carbon 13 to work on and back projects which were, the nature of the project was that it was going to still be relevant even if there's major geopolitical upheaval in the next 30 years, rather than projects where fundamentally the innovation was dependent on the current geopolitical order. I just mention it because I guess your listeners might be thinking about where to focus their efforts.
Yep, that's a very interesting mental model. Could you maybe give an example of what is a geopolitical dependent versus independent business based on what you've seen?
Well, look, if you're working on insurtech, for example, you could. I find it relatively easy to imagine, from a political economy point of view, a world order in which insurtech is less relevant because the state is dealing with climate risks in a different way to its current approach, right? Whereas if you're working on a device to pull methane out of water, and that's a real example from a Carbon 13 backed startup, Blue Methane, that's going to be relevant. We're going to need hydropower projects where there's going to be vegetation rotting at the bottom of the dam and releasing methane through the water. We're going to need that. That's going to happen under any foreseeable geopolitical configuration.
Yeah, I can see that. So it's basically solving physical, like physics based problems rather than geopolitics based problems. Is that a summary?
Yes, that's broadly what I'm saying. That's broadly what I'm saying. I'm not. I don't say don't do business model innovation, right? Or don't do these kind of intermediation plays. But just be conscious that if you're not having an impact, if you can't see the organization that you're founding or the organizations that you're partnering with surviving, upheavals in the world order, then maybe that's just an extra risk factor to take into account.
Absolutely. Very interesting. I'd love to take a step back and talk about the Tesla of houses. That's a very cool idea. So, one thing we repeatedly hear is that customers tend to overstate their willingness to buy sustainable products, like the premium they're willing to pay. So, when they answer surveys, always like, yes, we'll pay it, but then they don't actually put the money there. And Tesla, of course, has broken this, right? Because people think it's cool to own a Tesla, they buy Teslas, but it does still serve a very premium group and not a sort of mass population. Do you think these kind of products are always destined to be premium products, or do you think it can become mass market one day?
Oh no, I mean, so what we're seeing in EVs right now is Tesla created the category effectively, and now we've got these Chinese companies going crazy, BYD in the lead, but lots of other ones sorting out the mass market, right? And this is it's an important thought experiment for any entrepreneur, is to say, okay, well, look, it's unrealistic to think I, as an individual, or even through my one venture, my one team, that I am going to solve any tricky problem. Right? I know that we're all supposed to. I mean, I agree completely with the idea that we should stay foolish, and that we should sort of set the bar very high in terms of our ambitions. But I don't believe we should say, well, I and my company, I'm going to solve the whole problem, right? So Elon, for all of his flaws, created this category of EVs, and now and I have engineer friends who say, well, the problem with the Tesla is, why do we need such a high torque? Why do we need such a high range? Why do we even need such a high weight of vehicle? It's an overspec vehicle for what's really needed. What we need is something that's further down that is a mid-weight, mid-price, mid battery life product. Well, what I can say to my engineer friends is, yeah, well, that doesn't have to come from Tesla. That's going to come from fast followers. It's going to come from other companies. So if you're if you're a category creator, if you're a category definer in what you're trying to do, then I think you should be happy that you're normalizing some change that needs to be made, and then just accept the reality that others will play their part too. I was having a conversation, in fact, night before last, with a vertical farming startup, and my argument to them was, don't concentrate on, this will be the perfect end state, perfect circular economy answer to everything. Concentrate on what your firm can do. What are the means by which we're going to get to the sort of beautiful picture that you can see in your mind? And those means include somebody, and it might as well be you, creating that category and breaking through and really changing things.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way to think about it. I'm trying to think. So, would you say BYD is the fast follower of Tesla, given that it's growing at an even faster rate?
I mean, the founder saw that Tesla had solved many of the problems associated with EV technology. And therefore, and that's not just a question of, oh, well, we can learn from Tesla's innovations and we'll copy Tesla's innovations. That's a question of, well, from a point of view of capital formation, the world has seen that EVs are going to be a thing, right? EVs are going, it works, fantastic. It's no longer just a dream. Once you have that, then BYD can come along and say, well, we're going to be the Toyota to Tesla's Porsche or whatever, and we're not going to occupy a niche. We're going to be a mass player. So fast follower, absolutely.
Very interesting.
I mean,
Moving over to yes,
you see this in. I mean, as a strategy teacher, you see this in lots and lots of industries. That the first breakthrough player is a little bit is focused on the excellence of the solution, and then the fast followers are like, well, yeah, people don't actually need the high spec thing. They need something that works and that is priced competitively and so on.
Very interesting. I see how that can work. Switching gears to faster climate impact, I'm trying to think what are some top underexplored areas that need a full system level change. What are some areas that you're focusing on there?
Well, we're focusing on. I mean, it's pretty. Let me just caveat what I'm about to say by saying we've only been properly working on our technology scouting for about 8 weeks, right? So I have some early things to say, but it's the kind of thing where I'm a happy entrepreneur to talk about things while I'm still slightly embarrassed about them, but I am not yet. We're not yet fully sort of pitching these ideas. So one is creating a chain across energy storage and grid flexibility technology, and slightly contradicting the points that I was making earlier, the fundamental additions are in business model innovation, adding software, adding analytics, adding adding some fintech layers that are going to give the customers guaranteed performance and ensure guaranteed performance for them and so on. Second area is around biogas. The previous generation of biogas is suboptimal in terms of carbon, the way it deals with its carbon emissions, and we have a chance to bolt together some technologies in an interesting way that will solve that problem, and then valorize the CO2 that's part of the process. We also have some interesting ideas about geothermal. I'm really hot on geothermal. I'm part of a group here in the university that believes that once we crack geothermal, it doesn't have these intermittency problems of the other renewables, and it all happens underground. So some of the land use issues that we're currently grappling with on renewables, which of course bleeds into agriculture, get solved. So I think there's some interesting things to do. Now, the challenge, of course, is to figure out what's the integration that you can do now that isn't relying on some fantasy breakthrough that will happen eventually, but is not on the horizon just yet, but creates a viable business that then is surfing the waves, ready to take advantage of this shift that we see coming eventually.
And what's your secret sauce? Like, how are you able to identify these businesses that are at that point where the technology is ready and the wave is ready?
Well, I think the fundamental answer is the secret sauce is aggregation. You the the capital the venture capital system, let's keep it simple. The venture capital system that we have right now grew up in the digital age. Right? It's fundamentally, everything that we experience as venture capital these days comes ultimately from the amazing story of the microcomputer, right? And we're surfing waves that are really ripples from the giant explosion that was Microsoft and Apple, right? You can, the story of, well, you can back Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Mike Markula, and then 20, 30 years later, the company is the most valuable company in the world. That's a story that really informs for the venture capital system. Now, what's the challenge? The challenge is that, and you may be familiar with this concept, it's from the work of Vaclav Smil, the energy historian, all digital technology is underpinned by Moore's law, right? So if I'm working on compute, or if I'm working on software, or if whatever digital technology I'm working on, I can be pretty comfortable that all my prospective partners that I'm going to need 3 years down the road, 5 years down the road, they're working at the same pace and with the same rhythm that I am, right? Because if you sort of peel back the onion, the beating heart is, compute costs are falling and compute performance is going up, and therefore everything else kind of goes at the same speed. If you're outside the digital realm, then you just don't have that synchronicity in the way that everybody's working together. So if you look at the way that solar efficiency, solar power costs have gone down, it's not because there's some core technology like the solar cells themselves that is exponentially improved, or certainly not the kind of exponential improvement you see with Moore's law. It's because you've had some systems integration, and you've had enough systems integration that the different links in the chain have figured out how to work well together, and that's what's driven the improvements in efficiency. Now, so that's a basic engineering question, is can you drive faster climate impact by bringing the vertical chain together earlier than otherwise might be the case? There's also a policymaker aspect, right, that we can see. I've just finished reading a fantastic book called The Great Reconfiguration by Giels and Turnheim, which is all about looking at, okay, to the extent that we've had heating transitions, to the extent that we've had mobility transitions, to the extent that we've had electricity transitions, what was the interaction between the technology and the policy? And it's an unsurprising comment to say, well, the policymakers want to see something that looks like a winner before they back it, right? And so part of what Faster Climate Impact is trying to do with our aggregation is to give the policymakers something that clearly works, right? Give the policymakers something which clearly has customer acceptance, clearly is, the engineering is sorted out, and therefore they can get behind it, right? So that's aggregation on the policymaker level. So and a simple way of saying what I'm trying to say is there are not many large projects out there that have world-class engineering, great policymaker engagement, great governance, great customer acceptance, a real business strategy mindset behind what they're doing, a great governance setup. If you tick those 6 boxes, you're going to be your project is large, then you're going to be in the top quintile or top decile of projects worldwide. And we all know that a lot of money is going to get wasted in this climate transition. It's the nature of innovation. Do a really high quality project, and you're going to have something worth backing.
Nice. And are you looking mostly at the Cambridge University ecosystem here, or are you looking across the UK or globally for projects?
No, we'll be looking across Europe. One of my partners is based in Zurich. We're keen to build. One of our sort of sub projects is working on building up our connections with the TUM ecosystem, and I think that triangle of Zurich, Munich, Cambridge is an interesting one. But just for critical mass, I think you have to look across Europe. I'd love to tell a story to the policymakers about UK national champions, and I'm sure there will be some element of that in what we're putting together, but the best technologies, the best management teams And frankly, a lot of the capital formation that's going on in climate tech is not happening in the UK at the moment.
Great. So, given that you've been associated with Cambridge for a while, and of course, you've had Carbon 13 and you've spoken to so many entrepreneurs, what do you think is like a playbook? If I had to say, step 1 to 5, you're a research or engineering team at a university, you've come up with what you think is a interesting breakthrough that you want to bring to market. What would you say is, like the high level 5 step process to really bring this to market and turn it into a business?
Well, that's a great question. So, if your starting point is what you described, you're engineering based, science based, university based person, I would say step one for me is find a commercial co-founder. Right now, this is and that was baked into and is still baked into the ideas at Carbon 13, is that you know everybody accepts that you need these complementary skills around the founding table. But the typical pattern that I see in Cambridge and that I see generally with sort of technically driven startups is that the engineers set up the company, they drive the bus, and they say, yeah, of course we're going to get some commercial help eventually when we need it. Right? I think this is I think this is a mistake. I think you need to bring a commercial person around the table in the first founding team and get that commercial logic and customer-centric logic baked into the venture from the beginning. Right? So I think that's step one, is just swallow your I mean, of course in Cambridge we have a lot of brilliance around, and one of my pet peeves is that to get people to go on the entrepreneurial journey, which is scary and risky, we tend to puff up the egos of the brilliant scientists and engineers a little bit at exactly the wrong moment, right? Because when you're going on an entrepreneurial journey, you need maximum humility. You need maximum kind of openness to realizing that you've only got one piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and it may be a very special piece, but it's still only one piece, right? So I think that's step one, right? Form the team, bring the commercial logic in from day one. Don't treat the commercial side as a helper, but as a partner. I think that's step one. Step two is find some kind of pilot project, right? And my logic there is in a way is a carbon copy of what I just said. I.e., the research is really clear, the commercialization research is really clear that startups that engage habitually and continuously with market actors, with customers especially, do better than ones which say, well, the point of my startup is to get funding in so I can continue my work on the technical side. And I'm not trying to downplay the importance of the technical work. I'm just saying that you have to kind of do a triple helix, right? Where you've got the technical side, you've got the commercial and customer side, and you've got the business model side, all sort of developing in tandem. So I think pilot projects, even if they're really basic pilot projects, just the habits of customer engagement and being in the waves commercially and not just technically. I mean, in the waves like you're surfing the waves. That's to me the second step. Now, the good news, as you probably know, about the current climate tech environment is you can probably get that pilot reasonably swiftly. Right? It's been a fascinating thing to me as I've been in the climate tech space to see that we've got the ease of getting a corporate pilot is so much easier in climate tech than I've ever seen in any other startup domain during my career. If you can do both of those things before you engage with professional investors, I think it's fantastic, right? And of course, you might be able to do sort of keep the ship sailing just using grants up to that point, or grants and family and friends money, that kind of thing. So engaging with professional investors is probably the third step in the process. I would say you want to choose your investor partners very carefully. It's easy to think, well, if the investor wants growth and I want growth, the investor wants de-risking and success and I want de-risking and success, therefore we're aligned. But I think you have to look very carefully at the business model of the investor that you are engaging with and say, okay, well, that business model is going to drive the bus. So, I obviously, I think there's some very good VCs out there. I'm not down on VCs individually or as an asset class or as a kind of system for funding innovation. I think it works pretty well. Of course, any tournament. If you have a tournament where 1 in 100 contestants is going to win, and for 99 people out of 100, there's some pain in the experience, but nonetheless, the system is good. I think the system is good. I think it's a category error to say, well, I have this potential world-changing innovation, but I don't like the idea that I'm in a tournament and I might fail, so I'm going to step out of that tournament and seek other sources of finance, right? It's sort of like, well, yeah, I'm not saying there are no other paths. I'm not saying that at all, but I'm saying that you need to recognize that all of the other sources of finance other than VC come with a trade-off, which is they're not necessarily about high growth and fast impact. So, you really have to weigh up the trade-off in your mind. Very important to sort of interview the investors. There's a tendency to say, well, fundraising is a pain, and it is a pain, and therefore the sooner I can get it over, the better. And so I'm on a sort of random walk to find that first investor. You want to get advisors around the table. You want to get advisors around the table who've been there and done that, and who are able to help you understand, what is going to be a good match of investor for you. All, of course, in parallel with what I'm mentioning, you have to work on that triple helix that I talked about and continue the sort of customer engagement, continue the technical development, continue the business model development, but in tandem. Obviously, there are wrinkles I could go into, but those are the top priorities I would mention.
All of those make a lot of sense. When you think about climate founders and climate entrepreneurs, what are maybe 3 or 4 things that you think make great climate founders? What distinguishes the good from the great?
Oh, fantastic question. Well, I mean, partly we've covered my number one thing there that I've already talked about, which is humility and a realization that you're going to achieve what you need to achieve through partnership, through teaming, and you've got to pay, the stuff that's going on in your head is just not the important stuff, right? I mean, it's a piece of the puzzle, right? It's your ability. An entrepreneur, and you go back to the roots of the word, is someone who is all about the betweenness, right? They're all about the sort of, okay, how am I the link in the chain between whatever this thing that needs to be brought together with that thing, right? And so that, we sometimes say, oh, well, this is systems thinking, and that's a perfectly good way of describing it. But the challenge I see with the systems thinking framework is that I see a lot of people who are good systems thinkers, but they tend to think about the end system and be a bit light on the means by which you're going to make the steps to get to that system. When you're a systems thinker, you've got to think about means as much as you think about ends. Now, of course, I'm by focusing on this sort of humility and systems perspective and so on, I'm leaving out some of the basics, right? You have to be a great founder, you have to be an optimist. To be a great founder, you have to be able to take decisions at a pretty fast pace. A close colleague of mine here in Cambridge is one of the founders, former CEO of Cambridge Silicon Radio, which was Bluetooth. And he says, look, entrepreneurship is not rocket science. It's just making good decisions at speed, right? And I think that's absolutely right. Entrepreneurs have to be honest, and I think that's very important to have a high commitment to candor and to high integrity dealing, because if you don't have that as a baseline, you're going to trip yourself up at some point. Basically, it's much better to confront issues and I really like Kim Scott's book Radical Candor, and that was always the recommended reading for Carbon 13 founders. But it's not just about sort of being straight in business situations, it's about really acting with a high level of integrity. Tenacity, I suppose, and resilience, tremendously important, right? You just got to recognize that setbacks are data, right? Very little in in life generally, and certainly in the venture world, we shouldn't be taking things personally. We should be saying, well, yeah, the world is telling us something. What are we going to do with that information? Now, I, I think the ability to form and maintain relationships is really important for founders. I'm saying that slightly hesitantly because here's an area where I think teaming can really help. Because if you look at Microsoft as an easy example, right? I mean, we now look at Bill Gates and we say, wow, one of the most successful entrepreneurs of all time, an amazing leader, an amazing philanthropist, clearly a good communicator. But I think when he started out on the journey, he wasn't a very good talker. He wasn't a very good sort of communicator. He was, had some very good ideas, but really Paul Allen as his co-founder was absolutely vital to the thing, right? That you can have the greatest ideas in the world if you don't have somebody who's really good with people and managing people and connecting with people and keeping those relationships. Then again, it's like integrity. You're going to trip yourself up at some point if you don't have that. I think great founders have a lot of self-control, and that's a lot of brilliant people are struggle with self-control, right? The thing that makes them slightly obsessive and willing to kind of go further than others and pursue things in a sort of way that's orthogonal to the conventional wisdom. Some of that overlaps with, well, that obsessive behavior can detract from self-control. I would recommend to any founder, it's not really an entrepreneurship book, but it's a book by a guy named Marshall Goldsmith called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And it's sort of aimed, it's quite an ancient management book, 30 years old, something like that, but it's aimed at sort of successful middle managers to try to help them sort of self-coach, self-diagnose where they need to think about their behaviors and the way that they're going to work with other people. And then I think the best founders I've seen are super calm, right? I'm a pretty excitable person myself, but I think I have to say that an ability to maintain equilibrium is high on my list. So that's probably a longer list than you were looking for, but hope that was helpful.
That was helpful. One question I do have is which of those traits do you think are innate versus which ones can be learned or practiced?
Well, I mean, the beautiful thing about entrepreneurship being a team sport is if you don't have it, if you potentially can team up with others to get it, right? I think there's some reasonable research evidence that optimism is pretty innate. It comes from your background, and it's very difficult to shed a pessimistic attitude to life and adopt an optimistic one. Is integrity innate? That's an interesting question, but I think that my observation, frankly, is that people who grew up around unethical behavior in their early life struggle to get away from the example that was set for them. Sometimes I've seen people who basically they're so horrified by the unethical behavior they saw in their family or as a child that they set themselves on a path of higher integrity. But I think that there are this issue of integrity is fundamental. I'm sure you're familiar with the thinking about the self-control aspect that I mentioned. I'm sure you're familiar with the marshmallow test. There's some very interesting. Do you know the marshmallow test? The marshmallow test is the test where you give a 5-year-old a marshmallow and say, if you can. This is a famous psychology experiment. Say if you can stop yourself from eating that marshmallow for 30 seconds, then I'm going to give you 2 marshmallows. And some kids can do it and some kids can't. And there's some reasonable evidence that the kids who can hold on for 30 seconds and wait for that second marshmallow do better in life than the ones who can't stop themselves. And certainly the ability to defer gratification is fundamental to the whole venture process, right? That you're avoiding the easy path or the sort of the path that's aligned with the rest of the world, and you're going on an orthogonal path. And whether you're doing that as a pioneer or as a fast follower, you're somehow going to have some time to wait for the payoff.
Yep. Very interesting. And I think this concept of delayed gratification being super important in entrepreneurship is something that's talked about a lot. So yeah, it's great you touched upon it. I know we're nearly out of time. So my last question to you is more just about policy and ecosystem. So you mentioned earlier in the podcast that the UK may not currently have the best climate tech ecosystem. Maybe Germany's is a bit better. I don't know what your thoughts about the US are. So what do you think is like the key enabler at a country level to ensure there's more climate innovation going on?
Oh, wow. Yeah, fantastic question. Look, I mean, on an individual entrepreneur basis, if you're doing climate tech and you have the the ability in terms of immigration status to move to the US, I would move to the US. I mean, without question. In terms of the UK versus Europe, I mean, it's an interesting one. I'm and in terms of the interventions that might improve the situation, again, an interesting one. I mean, we have in the UK we have the best tax incentives for investors in early stage businesses of any country in the world, and so I'm a big evangelist for those, and I think every country that aspires to be more innovative should consider these kinds of incentives. We also, as much as it pains, I'm extremely anti-Brexit, but it so it's going to pain me to say the next thing I'm going to say, but the reality is that the UK does have some opportunities from its sort of island nation mercantile, trading mentality, we'll do business with anybody mentality. It all helps, right? In terms of the venture scene and the entrepreneurial world. So I certainly think that the UK is set to remain a very vibrant place for startups and climate startups in particular. In Europe, clearly the policy environment is such that that's a great place to be doing climate tech, because the engagement with potential customers is so easy, so fertile, because of the high regulatory pressure that every large business in Europe feels to get things done. I guess the cliche is about the it's hard to get started, right? It's expensive to get started. It's hard to get started. You can't just snap your finger and start a business. Arguably, if you're doing something in deep tech or hard tech, that's not really a problem, because you're going to have critical mass and aggregation issues all the way along your journey. So the fact that it kicks in early is not such a problem, right? People talk about we have a shortage of capital allocation for growth companies and so on. And I recently had a debate with one of my executive MBA students who was really deep in this subject and really has looked very carefully at this thing. And I'm engaged in all kinds of policy forums where people are saying, oh, we need to divert pension funds into this kind of stuff. I do think that that side of things is overblown, and the reason that we don't have more capital going into growth business opportunities in Europe is because the political economic situation doesn't support growth businesses, right? So I don't think that kind of fix is a good simple fix. I think you have to look at other drivers of the economy, and I'm not sure it's realistic or desirable to say, well, France needs to become more like California or Germany needs to become more like California. I think we have to play in a global ecosystem and play to our strengths and work on that basis. A friend of mine in Cambridge is working on a proposal for a Cambridge Stock Exchange. I think this kind of secondary markets, which are very supporting particular stages of growth, is something that could be done across Europe. But yeah, I'm sorry that I feel my answer doesn't provide a list of 3 clean silver bullets that we should apply. But these policy making questions are pretty complex, as you know.
Yeah, but I think it's just reflective of the broader climate ecosystem, right? Where there is no silver bullet anywhere. It's really going to be an aggregation of small improvements and changes everywhere that will eventually, hopefully, get us to where we need to be.
Absolutely.
And on that note, Dr. Chris, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to speak to you. I feel like I've learned a lot. Hopefully, everyone listening to this has learned a lot. And I wish you the best in your new venture with Faster Climate Impact.
Thank you so much. Good to have some time. Take care.
Thanks for listening in. If you enjoyed the conversation, please consider subscribing and tuning in to future episodes. See you around.